morning. Good morning. We are going to start the Sunday school hour off with 576. 576 before Brother Hanky comes up. Savior like a shepherd, lead us. It's always good to start the Sunday off recognizing that we do have a shepherd. We're not trying to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We have someone to care for us. 576. 576.
Savior like a shepherd, lead us, much we need thy tender care. In thy pleasant pastures feed us, for our use thy foes prepare. Blessed Jesus, thou hast bought us, thine we are. Blessed Jesus, thou hast bought us, thine we are.
All right, good morning. Good to see you. Glad you're here today. There's some familiar faces over here. Tim and Jana, good to see you guys. Do we need to call Pastor Daniels and tell him where you are when you're playing hooky? Does he know you're gone? Okay. Just sit way to the side, so hope Pastor doesn't call on them to pray or anything that gets their name called out, right? So anyway, good morning. Good to see you. And good to see some regular faithful attenders. Looks like Glenn's class is here today. Glenn went, I would much rather teach his class for him than make the drive that he had to make, but they drove all the way to Michigan and they're on their way back for a youth rally, set up a table to represent the college at Ambassador, and so we'll pray for their safety on the roads today. He's got Drew with him, is that right? And Kurt? Okay, well, 1 out of 2 hopefully will help him stay awake. So anyway, welcome to the rest of you as well. We always try to open our Sunday school hour here in the auditorium class, in particular, remembering our missionaries that are sent out from Maranatha Baptist Church. And before I say anything else, I just better make sure Gabe and Susan not here today. Okay, seems like every time I say Gabe and Susan aren't here, oh, they're here, you know. But they have transferred their base of operations closer to Raleigh. They're staying somewhere that, if I understand it correctly, it's about an hour from Raleigh. But for Susan's medical needs, they were having difficulty with the doctors and networks and stuff here in Gastonia, Charlotte. They were able to get set up with a doctor in the Raleigh area. And so you pray for them that they'll get answers and they get good direction on their treatment. And I'm sure they'll have some other meetings along the way as well. But do remember Gabe and Susan, even though we don't see them here as frequently. Remember the Maietas in Italy, and continue to pray for their work there in Grosseto, their ministry outreaches in different ways as well. And most of you are probably aware, but you know, we have voted as a church to send pastor there to be with the Maietas late October. I think it's last week October, first week November, somewhere along in that time frame. So we want to pray that the Lord will make that trip profitable as well. And you'll continue to bless the Maetta's ministry there. The Lockharts are here today, but let's continue to pray for their ministry there with Worldwide Mission in Kings Mountain. And Brother Lockhart does everything from fundraising to missionary care to, how do I say this nicely, missionary talk-ins to, if that needs to happen. Decisions, you know, all of those things. So a lot of varied responsibilities. Just pray the Lord will give him wisdom, and the Lord will continue to provide laborers for the harvest. And then Jed and Gloria are in Brazil as well. And I make sure I say the right town, because Pastor said Nova Matum last week, and that's where the Limas are. They're in Alta Floresta. And if I understand correctly, this past week, Jed was able to make another trip by airplane to visit some of the remote tribes that they've been working with. And I believe he even had an overnight stay at one of those, which, again, is an improvement in the relationship, an opportunity to spend more time talking with the chief, and especially in that context, the relationship with the chief is key to having permission to come and come back and that kind of thing. So still working on the paperwork to get the airplane that's been donated to their ministry, registered in Brazil and get it down there. That's, in the plans to happen as soon as all that can happen, but do pray for that. And then, pray for Gloria and the baby, and pray the Lord to give a good health and safety there. Yes, ma'am. Oh, boy. They thought, oh, boy. Okay, they were headed to Raleigh thinking that they had a solution, and now they found out that it won't work with their insurance. Okay, had not remembered that. So, all right, let's do pray with the Ivans about that scenario as well. All right, so let's go to the Lord in prayer and open our Sunday school time here together in prayer. Brother John Phillips, would you open us in prayer, please, sir? Amen. All right, we are working on a study of the kings of Israel and Judah, and we are going to be in the book of 2 Kings. We'll start in chapter 1, but we finished looking at King Ahaziah last time, which leads us to Joram. And so I have the chart of the timeline here, but I was going to try to draw it out in a little bit different way, because I'm going to switch feeds on you there, Brother Minion. I'm going to switch the Apple TV to the iPad here and see if that works. All right, there we go. It says I'm connected. But we're looking at a timeline here, and one of the things that you have to understand about the history books in the Old Testament is they're not always written in chronological order. Okay? So we would do history, in 1950, this happened in 1955, this happened in 1957, this happened in 1960, this happened. Am I connected there? Okay, it says I'm connected to NBC. I don't know what else I need to do. All right. I'm not connected here. So, all right. Well, if I can't, all right. It's trying to connect because the menu screen is disappearing, but then I got nothing. So, all right. I will just try to explain it. I thought it would be easier to draw it out, but if that's not going to work, then it's not going to work. But the history books of the Old Testament are not always chronological. Very often, it's more storyteller fashion, and they would tell the story about one person. So, for instance, if we were talking about the people that joined Maranatha Baptist Church and when they joined, we might start with, in this room, probably the longest standing members would be the Scovilles, and then Jeremy Lockhart's family when he was really young, and then, maybe the Harrises. That would be, way back. And I don't know if Krista were you already married by the time your dad took the pastorate? Okay. So, but anyway, if I were doing it Hebrew historian style, I would tell about Doc Scoville and how when Pastor Camp first came to Maranatha, he asked Brother Scoville to come and help with the music. And then, I would say, well, Doc Scoville served in that capacity for however many years, 15, 20 years. Whatever that timeline is, and he's still here. Right now, let me back up and say, shortly thereafter, I don't know which family came first, Lockhart or Harris, but we'll say the Lockharts came and they felt a kindred spirit and they joined, and here's here's Mel Lockhart, and here's the kids, and here's what they're doing, and that brings us all the way down to present. And Jeremy's a missionary out of our church. And all right, now let me tell you about the Harris family. And that's kind of the way that the Hebrew histories work sometimes. Rather than saying, 1950, 1955, 1960, 1965, and putting it in a nice chronological order, they will tell you all about one family or one person, and then once they get done with that, they'll say, now let me tell you about this other person, then we back up 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, depending, and they tell you about the people. So it's organized more that way, which is why when you get into the kings of Israel and Judah, it gets really, really interesting. And by interesting, I mean confusing, trying to keep up with it sometimes. Okay? But on the side with Israel, on the side with Judah, for the most part, you had longer times. You had Rehoboam, and then Abijah was very short, but then Asa ruled for 40 years. During the reign of Asa, you had 5 kings on the other side, Baasha being the longest, and several of them being 2 years. All right, well then by the time we get down to Ahab was king for 22 years. So we get a lot of the story about Ahab. Well, during that time, Jehoshaphat was king. Jehoshaphat became king, so he's ruling in the south while Ahab's in the north. Well, towards the end of Jehoshaphat's time, his son Jehoram overlaps with him a while. So, you have Jehoshaphat, and he's called Jehoram, and in the south, they overlap. They're ruling at the same time for a while. Then Jehoshaphat dies, and Jehoram continues on. Well, at the same time in the north, Ahab's son Ahaziah becomes king. He only lasts a year. He has no children. So then dies, his son Ahaziah becomes king, reigns 1 year, he's dead, and he had no son to take his place, so now another son of Ahab becomes king. Okay? That's who we're talking about now, son of Ahab. So Joram was the son of Ahab. So what was his upbringing? He's the son of Ahab. He grew up in the house of Ahab and Jezebel. What kind of household do you think he grew up in? Okay, ungodly. Ahab and Jezebel to this point were the most fervent supporters of Baal worship that had ever been seen in the land of Israel. Okay? So, he grew up in the household of Ahab and Jezebel, and he is going to follow in the general steps there as well. Okay? He's going to follow in their idolatry. Okay? But that would be his upbringing. All right, now let's talk about his reign. Okay, all we see here in verse number 17 is Jehoram becomes king in the 2nd year of the other Jehoram. Okay, then chapter 2 tells us about the translation of Elijah to heaven, and then we have to go over to chapter 3, verse 1. Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Now, wait a minute. I thought it was the 2nd year of the other Jehoram. It is. Chapter 3, verse 1 relates it to Jehoshaphat, who was the dad. But dad and son are co-rulers in Judah. And then this other guy comes on the scene at the same time you have co-rulers. So really I got 3 kings right now. 2 in Judah and 1 in Israel in the north. Okay? So, as far as timelines go, that's where we are. Now, we know, based on 2 Kings chapter 1, that during the reign of Jehoram, what prophet was active? 2 Kings chapter 1, we have the story of Elijah calling down fire on 50 plus a captain, so 51 and 51. Okay? So Elijah ministered during the reign of whom? Ahab, we know that. He went to Ahab and said, there's not going to be rain for 3 years unless I say so. And then there was that confrontation with Ahab and Jezebel on Mount Carmel and all the prophets of Baal, and called down fire from heaven and killed all the prophets of Baal. And Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you, boy. And he runs away. All right, that's my paraphrase. That's not really the Hebrew translation. But so we know that Elijah ministered during the time of Ahab. Okay? Well, then he also ministered during the time of Ahab's son, Ahaziah, because he's the same one that sent and told Ahaziah, you're going to die of this injury. So, and Elijah is still ministering now when we get this second son of Ahab, Joram. Okay? Now, if we were to back up to 1 Kings 19, we would find out that Elijah has already been told to anoint Elisha. So Elisha is following around with Elijah at this time. He's in training. So right now, at this time in Israel's history, both Elijah's the main prophet, Elisha's the prophet in training, and he's going to take over. Okay, and it looks like, based on 2 Kings chapter 2, that transition happened, during this time. Okay, the strange, when we get to, look with me, I'll jump ahead. television, movies, all of that, it does that. So music does matter. And here there was no words to this music, right? She's playing with her hand. Okay, this is just another example. Same thing with David in 1 Samuel and the evil spirit from the Lord that was on Saul. The only people in the world that will say that only the words matter and the music itself doesn't matter are carnal Christians who want to justify worldly music. Rock musicians will never tell you that. Pop musicians, classical music, they will not tell you music has no influence. Only people in the world that will tell you the music itself is neutral and only the words matter are carnal Christians who want to do something else. Okay? Biblically, it can be demonstrated if someone's mind is not already made up. I mean, if their mind's already made up, this is what I want, then they're not going to listen to this argument or the argument with David and the evil spirit or anything else because they've already decided this is what I want to do. But if someone is genuinely asking, there are several places like this where you can illustrate that instrumental music with no words does either correspond with a spiritual atmosphere or it corresponds with a ungodly atmosphere. Okay? If you don't think that's true, pick a bar here in Shelby. Well, go to Gastonia. Maybe nobody will recognize you there, but pick a bar in Gastonia, walk in and ask if you can be the musician, and you sit down and you play Amazing Grace. Okay? You sit down and play, have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood? You try that. Okay? Just play it. Don't sing the words. Just play that music and see how long you last before you get thrown out on your ear. See, that music doesn't correspond with the atmosphere they're trying to set there. Right? The music they play in the bar doesn't correspond with the atmosphere we're trying to set here. Okay? It's not that complicated. But here, Elisha says, all right, bring me a minstrel, which would have been a young lady servant who was a musician, and when she played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. Elijah gives the prophecy then. He says, all right, here's what you do. You dig ditches, and God's going to fill them with water. And he did. They dug the ditches. God filled them with water. God caused the enemies, the king of Moab, to see a visual illusion. And they thought it was blood. And they kind of waltzed in there expecting to just clean up the spoil, and they were wiped out. Okay? But that was, so that was King Joram here in chapter 3. Now, very interesting, in chapter 4, we have a familiar story, actually probably two. You have the story of the widow's oil being increased. And then you have the Shunammite woman and the story of the original prophet's chamber and all of that. And when we get into 2 Kings chapter 5, we have the story of the healing of Naaman and his leprosy. In chapter 6, we have the axe head that was borrowed and lost that Elisha recovered. See, this is exactly what happens in Hebrew history a lot of times. Chapter 7 and 8, you have the story of Israel defeating the Syrians, and then eventually they were under siege. And if you remember the story in 2 Kings chapter 7, you probably won't remember it by the reference. If I start telling you this story, you'll remember it. The king says, I want Elisha's head. And Elisha says, this time tomorrow, there's going to be wheat for a shekel and barley for a half a shekel. And the prince laughed. And Elijah said, you're going to see it, but you're not going to eat it. And the king appointed that guy to be in charge of it, and he got trampled because everybody was starving to death. Okay? All right, so what you have here then in chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is a whole string of stories that's primarily focused on the miracles of Elisha. Okay? Well then, in the end of chapter 8, we get to end of chapter 8 and chapter 9, the story kind of shifts back to Joram. Okay? But let's look here in chapter 6 just a little bit, because this does overlap with King Joram specifically. We'll talk about that. And really, in chapter 5, it's quite possible that when Naaman had leprosy, you remember the little servant girl said, well, there's a prophet in my country that can help you. Who did the king of Syria send Naaman to see? Anybody remember? Did he send him to the prophet directly? Who did he send him to first? Yeah, the king of Israel. Very likely that king of Israel was Joram here. Okay? Because we're talking about Joram or Jehoram in the north. It's very likely that when he sent Naaman to the king, it was Joram. And Joram's like, look what he's doing. He's trying to pick a fight with me. And Elisha says, hey, have you forgotten there's a God in Israel? Send him over here and he'll learn there's a God in Israel. Well, Joram was more than happy to pass that problem along to Elisha and not have to deal with it himself. Why would the king of Syria send him? Because in the pagan cultures, the prophets did the king's bidding. I mean, think about Pharaoh. And when Moses did the miracles there, what did Pharaoh do? He called his magicians and prophets and sorcerers, and they came and did miracles at the king's bidding. In the pagan cultures, that was very common. So he's like, all right, well, I'm going to send you to the king. The king will have his prophet do what he tells him to do, and this will all be taken care of. It didn't work that way with Elisha. But all I'm saying is this was very likely Joram there in chapter 5 as well. We're going to come back and just look at the miracles of Elisha, but today I wanted to try to get some focus on King Joram here. All right? So in chapter 6, beginning at verse number 8, 2 Kings 6, verse number 8. The king of Syria warred against Israel and took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, beware thou pass not such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down. All right, this is very likely Joram that we're talking about here. Joram, king of Israel, who's being warned. Verse 10, the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God had told him and warned him of, and saved himself there not once or twice. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing, and he called his servants and said, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? What does that mean? Which one of you is a spy? Which one of you is helping Israel? That's what he's accusing him of. It's the only thing that makes any sense to him. Verse 12. One of his servants said, none, my lord, O king. But Elisha, the prophet that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. And you thought bugs and monitoring were new to the 20th and 21st centuries. Here's my question. How did that Syrian know it was Elisha? That's what I want to know. I mean, they're trying to figure it out. Apparently, they would pass back and forth doing their trade and their business and their normal interactions between the countries and whatever. But you know how it is. If somebody gets a story to tell, there's some people, they just want to be the first one to tell it. And so somebody had told the story, and eventually it makes its way back to the king of Syria. All right. Verse 13, he said, go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. Behold, it was told him, saying, behold, he's in Dothan. Therefore he sent thither horses and chariots and a great host, and they came by night and compassed the city about. When the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, an host encompassed the city, both with horses and with chariots. And his servant said unto him, alas, my master, how shall we do? Or in our words today, what are we going to do now? Verse 16, he answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. That's a tremendous truth that I think still applies with us today. Verse 17, Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. The second mention of the chariots of fire, the first one was when Elijah was caught up to heaven. Okay? But here, verse 18, when they came down to him, Elisha prayed on the Lord and said, smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. So was this complete blindness, or was this more blindness in confusion, a lack of recognition? I don't think it was complete blindness where they were being led around by the hand, but rather God blinded them so they did not recognize they were talking to Elisha. God prevented them from understanding what was going on. He said, hey, the guy that you're looking for is not in this city, but I can take you there. And they're like, man, that'd be great. Would you help us out? And so he leads them right to Samaria. Now, a lot of times we read that story and we kind of move on. But what was Samaria? Politically, what was Samaria in this time? It was a capital city of what? Israel in the north. Okay? Who's the king there? Joram. He led them to Joram's front door. Okay? See, what the next verse here says, verse 21, verse 20, it came to pass when they were come into Samaria, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. What have you done? We're dead. Verse 21, the king of Israel said unto Elisha when he saw them, my father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? I mean, you got to read that with some enthusiasm. That's what he wanted to do, okay? Can I get them? Can I get them? Elisha says, verse 22, thou shalt not smite them. Wouldest thou smite those whom thou hast taken captive with thy sword and with thy bow? Set bread and water before them that they may eat and drink and go to their master. And he prepared great provision for them. And when they'd eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. So the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. And it came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his host and went up and besieged Samaria. Okay? So, initially he sent them down to get Elisha. Elisha leads them to Joram. Joram says, can I kill him? Can I kill him? No. You feed them, send them home. Just treat them like you would prisoners of war. So he fed them, sent them home. Well, then the next statement here, however much time passed, now they come back and they besiege Samaria. Who's still in Samaria? Joram. Okay? And now this is when the siege gets so bad that they are eating things that, and doing things that we would never dream of. Verse 24, came to pass after this, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his hosts and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver. Okay? I mean, based on some of the things that we see, in the parables of the New, in the parables of the New Testament, a coin was a day's wage. All right, so even using that scale, a donkey's head was over 2 months' salary, maybe more in this time. And that was not a delicacy. And no, it didn't taste like chicken. Okay? An ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. Okay, number one, really, we're buying that? Number two, that's a pint, approximately. You want to buy a jar of dove's dung? They were that hungry that they're like, okay, I think if I boil this long enough, I can change the taste. What are you going to do with that? That's how desperate they were. That's how desperate they were. Okay, but you still have Elisha, you still have Joram. Okay, are we given in the record of Scripture any time when Elisha saved him from the king of Syria, did Joram thank him? No. Here, when he brought the prisoners there and Elisha said, no, you can't kill him. Did he thank Elisha? No. But now, guess what he's going to do when the famine gets bad? Okay. Verse 26, the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, and there cried a woman unto him, saying, help, my lord the king. And he said, if the Lord do not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Now notice that phrase, the Lord do not help thee. See, it's all caps. He's referring to the true God of heaven. The God of Israel here. Said, if the Lord doesn't help thee, where am I going to help thee? Out of the barn floor or out of the wine press? In other words, he said, I got nothing to give you. If God doesn't help us, we're not going to be saved. Verse 28, the king said unto her, what aileth thee? And she answered, this woman said unto me, give thy son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, give thy son that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. Eating animal dung is bad enough, but cannibalism, I can't imagine. I literally cannot imagine. I'm putting up a block. I can't even go further than that in my own mind to take a child. What is our duty as parents? To do everything we can to protect and preserve our children, right? Not the other way around. They were that desperate, and I'm sure they'd gotten to the point where they said, I'm not going to be able to keep this kid alive anyway. There's nothing I can do that's going to keep this kid alive. Maybe the kid can help us stay alive a little bit longer. But that is such a twisted, demented, ungodly way of thinking. That's where they were here. Verse 30, it came to pass when the king heard the words of the woman, he rent his clothes and passed by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth on his flesh. Verse 31, then he said, God do so and more also to me, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat shall stand on him this day. What's he doing? He's blaming God for his problem, and then he's blaming Elisha as the representative of God. All right. Well, Elisha, you're the spokesman for the Lord, and it's obviously the Lord that's doing this to us, who, by the way, he did not worship. But anyway, he's like, all right, I'm going to kill Elisha. Verse 32, Elisha sat in his house, and the elders sat with him, and he did not get too worried about it. Okay. Then when we roll over into chapter 7, he said, look, by this time tomorrow, God's going to take care of it. And, it's all going to be turned around. Elisha did not die at the hands of Joram, but this right here, this is Joram. This is the king we're talking about. Okay? So this was the son of Ahab, ruler in Israel. He's the one that got Jehoshaphat to go against Moab. He's the one that was more than likely king when Naaman was sent down there from Syria. He's the one that here was part of the siege when they were selling a donkey's head and animal dung, and they were, boiling baby. This was Joram, if best I can tell, on the timeline. Okay, so that when we get into chapter 7, there's another separate miracle there with Elijah, but then God delivers them here. Chapter 8, Jehoram is wounded in battle. Chapter 9, he dies. Okay, but I have to kind of fast forward like this to hopefully try to connect some of the more familiar stories and events with some of the other ones that maybe are not as familiar, or, who's Jehoram, who's Joram, that kind of thing. But what we see here with Joram is he was son of Ahab. He didn't follow Baal, but he didn't follow God either. He had a hate-hate relationship with Elisha. I mean, they didn't care for one another. Mostly because he didn't want to serve God, and he didn't like the fact that Elisha did. So you have this conflict back and forth. But then in this period of time when Joram is king, that's when several, as far as we can tell, several of the major miracles of Elisha that are recorded would have taken place during this general time frame. Okay? There's more to be said, but we've got to quit there for today. And so let's close in a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Help us to learn from these examples. Help us, Lord, to when we recognize your power, as Joram may well have seen at Mount Carmel. Help us, Lord, to respond to you properly and to worship you and serve you as we should. Help us now in the preaching hour to come to pay attention. And I pray that you'd speak to our hearts and give us exactly what we need. And we'll thank you in Jesus' name.